J.D. Vance tries to humiliate Jasmine Crockett in a Senate hearing, but what she says next leaves the entire chamber in stunned silence. Stay to the end to discover the secret testimony that shook Washington to its core. Like, subscribe, and drop a comment to let us know what you think of this jaw-dropping moment in political history. It wasn't just a Senate hearing. It was a powder keg waiting to blow. That humid afternoon in Washington, D.C., the air inside the Hart Senate office building seemed thick with unspoken agendas and barely concealed contempt. The topic was supposed to be judicial ethics, an already charged subject in the wake of the Thomas Harlan Crow scandal. But everyone knew this particular hearing would veer far beyond procedural integrity. They knew, because Jasmine Crockett had just been added to the witness list, and J.D. Vance, the first-term senator from Ohio with a resume polished by tech money and conservative populism, had been gunning for a moment. This, he thought, was it. But Vance didn't understand what he was walking into. Because Crockett didn't come from a place that prepares you to flinch when a man with a law degree throws around condescension. She came from the courtroom, from Texas, from decades of watching men try and fail to knock her off her foundation. And on that particular afternoon, Vance didn't just pick a fight with a fellow lawyer. He picked a fight with a black woman raised by civil rights, sharpened by structural injustice, and armed with the kind of truth that doesn't blink when power pretends to be righteous. The tension began long before the cameras rolled. Sources inside the committee room, an aide to Senator Whitehouse, two staffers from the Congressional Black Caucus, and one particularly sharp-eyed journalist from The Intercept, told me that J.D. Vance had been rehearsing. Not preparing, mind you, rehearsing, practicing his smirks, his interruptions, his feigned confusion. The strategy was clear. Rattle Jasmine Crockett. Paint her as an emotional lightweight in a conversation about judicial ethics. The kind of dog-whistle politics that, if executed subtly, would play well on the right-wing media circuit. But Vance misunderstood something fundamental. He thought he was debating a caricature. He didn't know Crockett had spent the night before poring over Vance's own judicial record. Statements from his PAC donors and transcripts from obscure committee hearings he'd assumed no one remembered. She wasn't coming to defend herself. She was coming to ask questions. By the time they called her name, the chamber had already filled to capacity. The back row was jammed with Hill reporters, Hill interns, and Hill dreamers. Those who live for the electricity of a moment when everything might fall apart. A few of them whispered, "Watch this. She's gonna blow the roof off." Others chuckled skeptically, but no one left. Crockett's opening statement was concise, measured, calm. "I'm not here today to lecture," she began. "I'm here to listen, but I'm also here to remind you that listening is a two-way street. And when we talk about judicial integrity, we better be ready to look at who's defining it and why." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. What followed was a procedural round of questions from Republican senators. Cruz, Blackburn, then Vance. When his turn came, Vance leaned back like a man who had already won. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, resting heavy on her title like it was a mistake she hadn't yet earned. "You mentioned earlier that the judiciary ought to reflect the American people. Can you name a single circuit judge currently sitting who, in your view, meets your criteria of ethical clarity?" It was a trap. He expected her to fumble, to name someone and then watch him peel away their flaws like layers of an onion. But Crockett just smiled. Not smugly, coolly, calculated, like she'd seen this dance before. "Senator," she replied, "do you mean before or after their financial entanglements with private donors were exposed?" The room shifted. A gasp, but quieter than that. More like the subtle inhale of every intern who just realized they were watching something historic. Vance blinked. "I'm asking you for a name. And I'm asking you for a timeline," she said. "Because your colleague on the bench, Justice Thomas, once had a pristine record too. before it turned out his vacations were sponsored by billionaires who benefit from his votes. The moment hung in the air like a detonated truth. You could feel the weight of it settle in the marrow of the room. He tried to recover. "So you're refusing to answer my question?" Crockett leaned forward, just slightly. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut deeper now. Each word was a scalpel. "I'm not refusing, Senator. I'm reframing, because the real question isn't whether I can name one ethical judge. It's whether you're willing to call out unethical ones, even when they sit on your side of the aisle." That was the moment the room turned. Vance's smirk faltered. He glanced over at the staffer behind him, who shifted in his seat, eyes darting to the clock. The posture of someone realizing they were losing control, not of the narrative, but of the illusion they'd built to contain it. But Crockett wasn't finished. She reached into a folder and pulled out a printed donation ledger. "This document," she said, "is a list of campaign donations to PACs aligned with your office. 2 of the donors, names redacted here for confidentiality, have ongoing cases in the 6th Circuit where your advocacy has been unusually vigorous. Would you like me to read their docket numbers into the record?" Silence. No gavel. No protest. Just a long, raw pause where power stumbled into its own reflection. Crockett didn't press the moment. She let it sit. Let the discomfort bloom in full view. This wasn't a monologue. This was a mirror. And J.D. Vance was starting to see what he looked like when stripped of the stagecraft. Still, the backlash was immediate. As soon as the hearing adjourned, clips were circulating on Twitter. Fox News ran a segment calling Crockett unhinged, while MSNBC aired the full exchange in prime time. But online? Something else was happening. Black women attorneys across the country stitched their own stories into the moment. Hashtags emerged. One of them trended within an hour. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. But while the internet boiled with takes, Crockett left the building alone. I followed, discreetly, at a distance. It wasn't stalking, it was reporting. I'd covered hearings for 15 years, and I knew the difference between a viral clip and a cultural rupture. What happened that day was more than performative sparring. It was an earthquake, and Crockett had walked out like a woman who just felt the first tremors, but knew the aftershocks would be bigger. Down on Constitution Avenue, she paused near the reflecting pool. Alone, phone to her ear, nodding, listening, not celebrating, not tweeting, just standing with the weight of something heavy. That's when I realized, this wasn't just a showdown. This was the beginning of a reckoning. And it wasn't just about J.D. Vance or Jasmine Crockett. It was about a system cracking under the pressure of its own hypocrisy. And what happens when someone dares to name the fracture out loud? The headlines the next morning were vicious. The New York Post went with "Firebrand Crockett melts down in Senate hearing." Breitbart called her a loud-mouthed liability for the Democrats. Even Politico, normally more restrained, published a thinly veiled hit piece that referred to her as combative and unusually aggressive for a freshman member. The framing wasn't new. It was the same old playbook used whenever a black woman dares to speak truth to power without asking for permission first. But what was happening behind the scenes in Washington was more telling than anything on cable news. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had barely returned to her office when she was summoned to a private meeting with Representative James Clyburn. Not in a committee room, and not in the press-friendly corners of Capitol Hill. No, this meeting took place in a small, windowless conference space in the Rayburn building. A room they used when they didn't want what was said to be overheard, or recorded, or even noticed. I spoke to 2 people familiar with the meeting. One a longtime staffer in the Democratic Whip's office, the other a policy advisor close to the Congressional Black Caucus. They painted the same picture. A collision between generations. Respectful, but loaded. Clyburn, the elder statesman and a deal-maker through and through, didn't yell. He didn't threaten. That wasn't his style. But he made it clear that what Crockett had done wasn't just brave. It was dangerous. "You hit a nerve," he told her, according to both sources. "And the thing about nerves is, when you hit one too hard, it twitches. This building doesn't forget who makes it twitch." Crockett listened. She always listened. But she wasn't there to apologize. "Sir," she said, "with respect, if this building didn't twitch, it wouldn't feel anything at all." That line would later be quoted by journalists and scholars alike. But in that moment, it was a quiet act of defiance. Not an insult. A boundary. A refusal to play politics as usual. What followed was less a reprimand than a warning. Donors were calling. Committee assignments were at risk. She might find herself increasingly isolated in future negotiations. She could expect calls from leadership, and not the congratulatory kind. But Crockett already knew. She'd seen it happen to others before her. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez challenged Pelosi on climate. When Cori Bush refused to back down on police reform. When Ayanna Pressley asked too many questions about redistricting. There was a pattern, and it had a name. Strategic containment. Keep the firebrands busy. Keep them loud enough to appease the base, but not so loud that they change the system. But Crockett had no intention of being contained. Later that afternoon, she returned to her office and found a letter slipped under the door. Unsigned, handwritten, on a torn sheet of legal pad. It read, "Your voice made it through. Keep going. They're scared." There was no name, no envelope, just those words. Security flagged it, of course. The Capitol Police ran it through all their systems, and it didn't match any known threats. They cleared it as non-hostile, probably just a supporter. But Crockett kept the note, folded it, put it in her wallet. Because for all the noise, all the backlash, all the attempts to minimize her, someone had seen through the fog. And they understood what this really was, fear disguised as decorum. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance was doing damage control of his own. He appeared on Tucker Carlson today, describing the hearing as a clown show, claiming he had been ambushed by a radical with a law license. But even Carlson seemed cautious, not because he didn't agree, but because he sensed what Vance didn't. The public was watching, and something about this clash didn't sit right with independent voters. That same night, Vance's communications director made a critical error. In an attempt to undermine Crockett, she tweeted a clip of her reading the PAC donor names, with the caption, "Is this even legal?" The post backfired instantly. Twitter lit up with constitutional lawyers, journalists, and even former ethics officers clarifying that yes, it was absolutely legal, and that transparency was kind of the point of congressional oversight. But it wasn't just a public misstep. It triggered something deeper. Within 24 hours, a group of investigative journalists began quietly combing through J.D. Vance's financial disclosures. Not for revenge, for truth. And what they found would soon take this story in an entirely new direction. Because buried in the disclosures, on page 17 of a 25-page filing, was a series of stock trades made by a family trust linked to Vance. Trades that curiously aligned with Senate briefings and committee votes that were never made public. The journalists didn't go public yet. They were still verifying, still building the case. But word began to spread on Capitol Hill. Whispers in elevators, hushed meetings behind closed doors. A Democratic senator from the Judiciary Committee, whom I won't name yet, allegedly said to a colleague, "If Crockett didn't rattle his cage, we never would have looked." Meanwhile, in her district back home in Texas, Crockett's approval rating soared. She received over 6,000 new campaign donations in 48 hours, mostly under $20. Her campaign manager had to triple the size of the volunteer database. Black law students across the country started citing her testimony in their classes. But more important than any donation or headline was the ripple effect. 1 week after the hearing, Representative Pramila Jaipal, introduced a bill proposing stricter financial disclosure requirements for members of Congress and their immediate family members, naming the bill the Crockett Clause. It was largely symbolic. Everyone knew it wouldn't pass in the Senate. But the symbolism mattered, because now, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a moment. She was a movement. And that's when the threats began. The first came by phone. A voicemail left on her district office's answering machine. Male voice, white, southern accent, slurred speech. Something about her being a dangerous black Marxist. The recording was forwarded to Capitol Police. The second was a letter, postmarked from Cincinnati, Ohio, Vance's state. It contained a Bible verse, a single bullet casing, and the words, "Keep talking." That one wasn't ignored. It triggered an emergency security detail increase, and the FBI was pulled in. For many in Congress, this would have been the moment to step back, to pull their punches, to smooth it over in the name of bipartisanship. But Crockett responded the only way she knew how. She filed a request for a second appearance before the Judiciary Committee. This time, not as a guest witness, as a formal challenger to the ethical immunity enjoyed by sitting members of Congress. And it was this move, not the hearing, not the headlines, not even the viral clips, that changed everything. Because by daring to call for accountability within her own chamber, she wasn't just taking on Vance. She was taking on the institution itself. And the institution, as it turns out, doesn't like mirrors. By the following Monday, the political machine had quietly begun its most reliable ritual, suppression by procedure. Crockett's request for a second Judiciary Committee appearance wasn't denied. It was under review. That phrase, so gentle on paper, was the same bureaucratic blade used for decades to bleed inconvenient truths dry. Inside Capitol Hill, this is how the resistance moves. Not through shouts or denials, but through calendars that never open and emails that never reach the scheduler. But this time, suppression wouldn't be quiet, because someone leaked the emails. At first, it was just a handful, internal memos between Republican staffers on the Judiciary Committee. They were passed anonymously to a journalist from ProPublica, who verified them and dropped a story that detonated across political Twitter within minutes. The email showed aides discussing how to politely stall Crockett's second appearance, referring to her as a PR hazard, a low-yield trap, and most damningly, a walking reminder of Clarence's problem. That last line was an apparent reference to Justice Clarence Thomas, and the scandal Crockett had dared to put back in the headlines. The GOP responses were predictable. They called the leaks fake, misquoted, selectively edited. But ProPublica doesn't play games with sourcing, and their follow-up revealed metadata, timestamps, and even the name of the communications staffer who drafted the talking points memo that included a strategy to redirect her testimony via a last-minute rule invocation. But what no one saw coming, what hit Crockett like a slap to the soul, was that the leak also included a second chain of emails, this time from a Democratic office. Specifically, one of her own colleagues from Texas, a member of the Moderate Problem Solvers Caucus, and someone she'd campaigned beside in 2022. His chief of staff had written, "We all know she's right, but it's not helpful. This thing is getting out of hand. I'm not losing PAC access because Jasmine wants to start a revolution." That was the moment it crystallized for her. This wasn't just a partisan problem. It was systemic. Rot doesn't wear red or blue. It's bipartisan. And it doesn't always announce itself with scandal. Sometimes it wears the soft smile of a colleague who asks you to tone it down, for the good of the party. But Crockett had never run for office to protect a party. She'd run to protect the people who never got a seat at the table. So when the Capitol woke up on Wednesday to find her standing at the east steps of the House, flanked by 24 black women attorneys and civil rights leaders, it wasn't just symbolic. It was declaration. She took the podium without a teleprompter. No script, just a voice and a truth no committee could file away. I came here thinking we could hold people accountable. I still believe that. But if this building can't handle honest questions, then it's not the questions that are wrong. It's the building. The crowd erupted, not just in applause but in knowing. The kind of knowing that resonates deep in the bones of those who have been silenced for asking why too many times. But even as the rally gained momentum, the machine moved faster. That afternoon, news broke that Crockett's committee assignments were under re-evaluation. The language was vague, but the timing wasn't. And behind the scenes, a coordinated media effort was underway to brand her as divisive, distracting, even unfit. CNN ran a panel where a former DNC strategist called her behavior reckless. The Washington Post published an op-ed titled, "Jasmine Crockett's Moment of Fame Could Cost Democrats the Senate." One unnamed source in the piece, allegedly a longtime senior Democrat, called her a ticking clock on the party's stability. But none of them were asking the most important question. Why did her truth cause this much fear? It was a question that finally found an answer in a set of documents delivered anonymously to the Guardian's D.C. office. What those files revealed would become the turning point of the entire saga. Within them were communications between a right-leaning legal nonprofit and J.D. Vance's senior staff. Emails and internal memos detailing a lobbying strategy aimed at shielding justices from new disclosure laws. One memo, dated 3 months before the Crockett-Vance clash, listed key risks and named her specifically as an emerging problem with courtroom credibility and grassroots appeal. There it was, in black and white, evidence that Crockett had been marked before she ever stepped into the hearing. They weren't reacting to her clapback. They were bracing for it. But the real bombshell came in a file labeled Judicial Sentiment Modeling, Ohio Focus. The file outlined a data operation run out of a shell LLC based in Columbus, Ohio, funded by donors connected to Vance's old venture capital circle. The modeling project had been training AI to forecast judicial outcomes based on judges' past rulings, and was being pitched to corporate clients who wanted to predict and potentially sway outcomes in appellate courts. That kind of predictive modeling, if ever connected to legislative strategy, wasn't just unethical. It skirted the edges of judicial tampering. Crockett now had more than her voice. She had a smoking gun. But as she read through the files, printed and hand-delivered by her staff, not trusted to email, she paused on one sentence. Our success depends on maintaining a perception of neutrality in public-facing narratives. That line haunted her, because now the goal was clear. Control the story, discredit the messenger, and preserve the illusion. The next 48 hours were a blur of strategy, phone calls, security updates, and moral calculus. Several senior Democrats asked her to wait before going public. Let the media vet it first, they said. Give the caucus time to prepare. But she knew what that meant. Delay, deflect, diminish. So she did what she always did when the moment demanded clarity. She wrote, at 3:17 a.m., Jasmine Crockett posted a thread that would become the most reshared political statement on social media in 2025. It began with one sentence. They told me to sit down. I brought a chair. And then she laid it all out. The emails, the memos, the predictive judicial modeling, the internal betrayal, the threats, the stall tactics. She tagged no one, blamed no party. She just told the truth and ended the thread with a promise. I will testify, with or without their permission, because the people didn't elect me to whisper. The next morning, the media flipped. Headlines shifted, commentators recalibrated, supporters mobilized. But even as her movement swelled and the story expanded beyond the Beltway, trouble was brewing in silence. Late that night, Her chief of staff received an alert from the cybersecurity team. Crockett's personal devices had been hacked, contacts wiped, messages intercepted, calendar access breached. And the most disturbing part? Whoever did it hadn't tried to steal anything. They were just watching. At first, they thought it was just surveillance, the kind of quiet intrusion any high-profile lawmaker faces once they begin tugging on wires woven too deep into Washington's power grid. But the breach of Jasmine Crockett's personal phone and cloud data was not passive. It was strategic, and it was timed to the minute. Her team's cybersecurity consultant, a former NSA analyst turned private sector watchdog, confirmed that the intrusion began precisely 12 minutes after her viral thread went live. Not 11, not 13, 12. It wasn't random. It was a response. The forensics team found something else, something that turned concern into alarm. The breach hadn't originated from an amateur operation or a foreign bot farm. The point of entry was traced back to a private intelligence firm under federal contract, Clarion Analytics, a shadow outfit that had previously worked on data resilience for the Department of Energy and digital forecasting for multiple GOP Senate campaigns, including one tied directly to J.D. Vance's donor network. The connection wasn't speculative. It was logged. Clarion had pinged Crockett's phone server from a secure Virginia node commonly used for non-attributed testing. That kind of activity usually comes with a government order. But this one hadn't gone through official channels. It had been masked, cloaked, disguised as a routine packet sweep. It was anything but routine. The breach had scanned all of Crockett's files labeled ethics, donor conflicts, and testimony drafts. It pulled metadata from her encrypted messages, including timestamps of conversations with journalists, lawyers, and a former federal judge who'd quietly offered her strategic advice. And then, just like that, it vanished. No trace on the front-end systems. No notifications. No pings. If not for a random error log flag during a server update, it might have gone completely undetected. When her chief of staff confronted the Capitol's internal IT security detail, they gave her the same answer that always precedes cover-ups in Washington. We'll escalate this to the appropriate oversight office. It was a dead end. That same night, Crockett received a call from an unlisted number. The voice on the other end was male, older, slow to speak but certain in tone. He introduced himself only as Oren. "I used to be on the inside," he said. "Now I help the people they follow." She almost hung up, but something in his cadence stopped her. "They don't want to stop you," he continued. "They want to make you doubt yourself. It's cheaper than a smear campaign, and twice as effective." He gave her no proof, no credentials, only a warning. "If they know you're holding sensitive files, they'll monitor everyone you talk to. Assume nothing is safe. Not your staff. Not your folders. Not your printer. If you're going to drop the bomb, do it in person. One room. No phones. One witness." She asked why he was helping her. "Because the last person they silenced was my daughter," he said. "She tried to expose the same thing you're holding. She didn't get the chance. The line went dead." Crockett didn't tell her team. She didn't want panic, but she began writing everything down, longhand in ink, in a locked legal notebook with no digital trace. And she did something else. She stopped using her phone. For the first time in her political career, she unplugged. 3 days later, she emerged from her office with a single plan. If they wouldn't let her speak in Congress, she'd create her own hearing. And she had the perfect place for it. An abandoned DC community center once used for civil rights strategy meetings during the 1960s. Its basement auditorium, dusty, sunlit through broken blinds, empty but sacred, would host what would later be known as the People's Oversight Session. She invited 2 retired judges, 3 investigative journalists, 5 former ethics officers, and 1 member of Congress, Representative Jamie Raskin, who had quietly supported her since the leak. There were no gavel strikes, no Roberts rules, no C-SPAN feed, only folding chairs, notepads, and cameras held by trusted indie media groups. Crockett began by reading her original testimony, the one she was denied. Then she presented the files, the Vance-linked judicial modeling project, the lobbying strategies, the internal betrayals, and finally, the Clarion Analytics breach. Every word was documented, every page recorded. When she reached the end, there was no applause, just silence, the kind that follows truth spoken too plainly to ignore. But the silence didn't last. By morning, the video had reached over 10 million views. The hashtags returned, fiercer now. Hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag Vance exposed, hashtag people oversight. But more surprising was who began sharing it. Former federal prosecutors, sitting judges, even two Republican state attorneys general, one from Massachusetts, the other from Utah, publicly called for an inquiry into the Clarion breach. J.D. Vance, for the first time, issued no comment, not even a denial. That same day, Senator Dick Durbin confirmed that Crockett's Judiciary Committee testimony would be rescheduled, pending internal review of evidence. But the pushback came hard and fast. Mitch McConnell called it a partisan witch hunt cloaked in civil theater. Lindsey Graham suggested Crockett may have broken federal protocol by holding an unsanctioned hearing, and a fresh wave of anonymous op-eds began surfacing, calling her tactics radical, insubordinate, dangerous. But none of it mattered anymore, because something irreversible had happened. For the first time in years, the American public was talking about judicial ethics, not as a technicality, but as a crisis of democracy. Cable news couldn't keep up. They'd spent so long chasing polls and palace intrigue. They'd forgotten how much a single woman with conviction could disrupt their rhythms. But for Crockett, the most important message didn't come from Congress or Twitter. It came in a handwritten note, delivered by courier to her office. No return address. They silenced her. You gave her voice back. Orrin. Attached was a photograph of a young black woman standing in front of a courthouse, holding a sign that read, "Justice doesn't wait for permission." Crockett sat with that image for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't post. She simply stood, walked to the window, and looked out at a Capitol that was finally, however briefly, trembling under the weight of its own reflection. But as history would soon remind her, the fight was far from over. Because the very next morning, Crockett's email account was frozen by the House IT department. The official reason? Unusual network activity. The real reason? She was one step from naming names. And they were getting desperate. She arrived without an escort. No entourage. No cameras. No chance in the hallway. On the morning of her rescheduled Judiciary Committee testimony, Jasmine Crockett walked into the Capitol wearing a black suit, holding a single worn leather folder under one arm, and a steel resolve that hadn't wavered. Not after the breach, not after the threats, not after the calls from party leadership begging her to tone it down for optics. Inside the hearing room, every seat was taken. The gallery had been reserved for staff and press, but someone, likely a sympathetic aide, had let in a handful of law students, mostly black women, who now sat quietly in the back row, pens in hand, breath bated. The committee chair, Senator Durbin, opened with a brief acknowledgement of recent revelations and the gravity of today's proceedings. But the electricity in the room wasn't coming from Durbin. It was humming around J.D. Vance. He looked exhausted. His staff had spent the last 72 hours trying to reframe the narrative, releasing partial statements, leaking new talking points, publishing a Medium post no one read. But Vance knew. Today, there would be no redirection. Today, the cameras weren't the threat. The truth was, Crockett was sworn in. And as she sat, adjusted the microphone, and looked out across a semicircle of senators, some glaring, others politely blank-faced. She spoke. "Members of the committee," she began, "I've been called many things in the past 2 weeks. Unprofessional, radical, even ungrateful. But what I've not been called, until now, is correct." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not from her tone, which was even and firm, but from the certainty behind her words. "I'm not here to vindicate myself," she continued. "I'm here to explain why so many Americans no longer trust the judicial system, or this body tasked with overseeing it. And it's not because they're confused. It's because they're paying attention." She reached into her folder and pulled out a stack of documents. Exhibits, she called them. The Clarion breach. The PAC donor overlaps. The judicial modeling. She walked the committee through each piece methodically. No dramatics, no finger-pointing. Just facts, chronology, evidence, and implication. But the moment that broke the room came 37 minutes in. She looked directly at J.D. Vance. "Senator," she said, "when you challenged me 2 weeks ago, you asked for names. Let me give you one." She held up a photo, printed, not digital, of a man in a gray suit shaking hands with Justice Clarence Thomas outside a private jet. The man was a major donor to both Vance's PAC and a non-profit aligned with Clarion Analytics. "We traced lobbying payments from this individual shell company to your digital outreach firm 6 weeks before you voted against judicial oversight reform." Vance tried to interrupt. Crockett didn't flinch. "The American people deserve to know," she continued, "if their senators are protecting judges or protecting investments. It wasn't the volume. It was the silence after. The kind of silence that arrives when something undeniable has just been laid bare, and no one has the words, or will, to pretend otherwise." Senator Whitehouse leaned in. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, "are you formally alleging that sitting members of this chamber have engaged in indirect financial conflicts of interest with members of the judiciary?" She answered without hesitation. "I'm not alleging, Senator. I'm confirming. The paper trail exists. The behavior confirms it. The silence confirms it. And if this body refuses to act, then the American people will know exactly who to blame." Durbin tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but it was too late. The fuse had been lit. For the first time in years, the Judiciary Committee sat under the weight of something more than partisan bickering. They sat under the burden of accountability. After her testimony, Crockett walked out the same way she came in, alone. But this time, the hallway didn't whisper. It applauded, quietly, carefully, but with intent. She didn't speak to reporters, didn't stop for photos, just made her way outside, where the air smelled like rain, and 100 small cameras tracked her every step like something sacred had just walked through fire and come out clean. But there was one more twist. That evening, as Crockett prepared to leave her office, her chief of staff rushed in holding a manila envelope. No postmark, no courier, just a simple, unmarked file placed neatly on her chair. Inside, a deposition transcript, dated 3 years prior, sealed under a judicial gag order. The deponent, J.D. Vance. The case? A closed-door arbitration involving insider influence on state judicial appointments. The transcript revealed that Vance had once advised a conservative donor group on how to incentivize judicial candidates to remain loyal to specific interpretive doctrines, particularly those related to corporate liability. Crockett stared at the final line of his sworn testimony. There's no need to pressure judges. You just need to make them believe their future depends on stability. And that stability comes from us. The U.S., of course, was never defined. But it didn't have to be. By midnight, Crockett had forwarded the transcript to 3 federal watchdogs, 1 ethics committee, and every journalist who'd ever bothered to ask why integrity in Washington was always on the clearance rack. She didn't wait for permission, because she knew something they hadn't counted on. That sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one yelling. It's the one who waited, listened, documented, and chose her moment. J.D. Vance had tried to turn a hearing into a spectacle. What he got was a reckoning, and for once, the echoes of that moment didn't fade in the news cycle. They reverberated into classrooms, courtrooms, bar exams, and ballots. Because Crockett's question wasn't just a question. It was a mirror, and America was finally looking.